Hi everybody. So welcome to our second chess class. In the first class, we talked about um, the basic chess rules, the chess notation, and how a bishop, rook, and a queen moves on the board. Now we're going to talk about the rest of the pieces. So after today's class, you will be able to move. Um, you'll be able to play a game. Now, we won't be able to finish a game, but we will be able to know how all the pieces move, so you can move all of the pieces. Okay, so let's do a quick review, everybody. What are the name of the pieces? I'm going to point my arrow to a piece, and then you can say the name, and then I'll tell the answer in a few seconds. So everybody, what is the name of this piece that we talked about last week? If you said this is a pawn, excellent, good job. This is a pawn, everybody. We have 8 pawns. Black also has 8 pawns. All right, what is the name of this piece? If you said this is a king, excellent, this is a king indeed. All right, what is the name of this piece? So this is a knight, everybody. If you said knight, good job. This is indeed a knight. Let's look into this piece. Everybody, if you said this is a rook, good job to you. This is indeed a rook. All right. What is the name of this piece? Everybody, if you said this is a queen, good job to you. This is indeed a queen. And lastly, let's talk about this one. What is the name of this piece? Everybody, if you said this is a bishop, good job to you. This is indeed a bishop. All right. So everybody, remember that white gets to go first, and white is always sitting at this number 1 line, right? We talked about these horizontal lines. This is the first rank. So you can also remember that because number 1 is the first number, right? White gets to go first. Okay. Now, everybody, let's remember from last week how the bishop goes. A quick review. Everybody, the bishop goes like an X. It moves diagonally. So if this bishop wants, it can go to all these colored squares right now. Don't worry about that red colored square, that's not important. This is how the bishop goes. And if a black piece is on one of those green squares, everybody, let me put up a black piece, we can go ahead and capture it. Everybody, in this position, the white bishop can go ahead and capture this black knight right now. But let me ask you all a question. Can this white bishop capture this black rook at f7? Everybody, as we know, the bishop goes diagonally, so this is not going to be a diagonal, and therefore the bishop cannot move like this. This is not true for the bishop. Okay, so everybody, this is how the bishop moves that we mentioned last week. Now there's something important about the bishop, everybody. When we start the game, you see both white and black, they have 2 bishops. One of the bishops is on a dark square and the other one is on a light square. And we just talked about how the bishop goes like it's like an X, diagonally. So everybody, you see on the chessboard, now I'm going to remove the pieces and put the bishops back and the kings. Everybody, you see on the chessboard, since the bishop goes diagonally, a dark squared bishop can only go on dark squares because that's the x. And a light squared bishop can only go on light squares. This is very important. Okay. Now, let's remember how the rook goes. The rook, everybody, goes like a plus sign as we discussed last week, right? It can go up, it can go down, it can go to the right, to the left, like that. So it doesn't have any limits. It can go to all these squares in one move. So if you want to move the rook to here, you can. If you want to move the rook to here, you can. But remember, everybody, we can only make one move per turn. So we have to decide the best move to do. Okay. Now, everybody, lastly, we talked about the queen. Let's place the queen to here. As we know, queen is the strongest piece on the chessboard because the queen can go like a bishop and a rook. So everybody, the queen can go in all these directions. It can go like an X, like a bishop, and it can go like a plus sign, like a rook. And if we combine them, we get this beautiful pattern on the chessboard. Very colorful. Okay. And everybody remember, for this queen to be able to capture a piece, it has to be the opponent's piece, and it has to be in one of these colored squares, because that's where the queen can go, right? You cannot capture a piece if we cannot go to that square. So let me show you what I mean by this, everybody. Well, I'm going to place a few pieces on the board right now. Okay. So everybody, in this position, the white queen is attacking a black piece. We're attacking the black bishop. And if it is white's turn, white can go ahead and capture this black bishop right now. When we capture a piece, we move our piece to that piece's location, and we remove that piece out of the chessboard. And then we place our piece into that square. We can just move the bishop to the side of the board, but it no longer is in the chessboard. So everybody, this is exactly what we can do. But now everybody, you see the knight is also very close to the queen, but the queen can go diagonally and it can go to the left like the rook, but it cannot go to the square that the knight is sitting at right now. So the queen cannot capture the knight right now. This is very important to everybody. The queen cannot capture the knight. Okay, so this is what we have done last week. Let's talk about the king. How does a king move, everybody? Now, we said the king is the most important piece on the chessboard, and that's very true. We must have a king to play the game. You can lose all the other pieces and just have a king, and you are still able to play the game. But you must have a king to play the game. Now, everybody, the king goes like a queen. It can go in all directions like a rook and a bishop combined. But the king is very lazy. So the king only goes one square. The king can only go one square, everybody. So if the king wants, let's focus on the white king right now. If the king wants, it can go to this C3 square. If it wants, it can go to this square. Or it can go to this square or to here, 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 or here. So everybody, the king can go to all of these squares because it can only go one square at a time. Okay, so if we want to move the king to here, now everybody, our king moved one square. Let's look into the black king. The black king can also go one square. So both the white and the black pieces, they move the same way, everybody. If the king wants, they can also go here. But the king can only go one square at a time. So if a king wants to capture a piece, that piece has to be right next to the king. It has to be in a square that the king can go in one step, right? Let me show you what I mean by this. Everybody, let's see this black rook. You see, the white king cannot reach the black rook in one step, but it could try to go there in two steps. First, white can try to go to here, and now it is black's turn. If black moves the king like this, we can go ahead and capture that rook. But black can also move the rook away, so this is something to keep in mind. Everybody, kings, they go one square at a time, and they can only go one square at a time. Okay, so king is pretty simple, everybody. Now we are going to talk about the knight, the little horse-looking piece that we have. Now, everybody, you see, the knight is, so the knight is technically a horse, right? And what does a horse do? A horse jumps. So the knight is the only piece that can jump on the chessboard. And we're going to see how the knight jumps in a second. Now, everybody, the knight goes in what we call an L shape. You can make an L with your hand, right? You can make different L's, you can rotate it, and these are all L's. Now the knight, everybody, goes like an L shape. So let's make an L like this, and let's look into my hand. You see, everybody, if a knight is at the top part of the L, it goes from here all the way down to this part. So it jumps in that L shape. So let me show you what I mean by this. So let's make that same L over here. Everybody, the knight is at the tip of the L, so if it wants, it can go from here down to here. And this is how the knight moves. It moves in an L shape. So everybody, as you can see, this L can be turned into this L. This is a reverse L, but it is still an L, and the knight can still move in that direction. So let me show you. Let's make that L shape right now. Everybody, the knight can go like this. And this is, again, an L shape. So if we want to make the L shapes, it would look something like this. So, for example, this would be an L shape. This would be an L shape. This would also be an L shape, but that's like an L like this, right? It's like upside down, but it is still an L shape. You can also make an L shape like this. You can also make an L shape like this. But everybody, in the L shape, you can think like you go 2 squares in one direction and then you move to the right, left, up or down, depending on where the movement is, 1 square. So if the knight wants to go 2 squares down, then it has to go 1 square to the right or left. That's why the knight can go like this, everybody. If it is going 2 squares to the right, then it has to go 1 square up or down, and it can go like that. These are all the squares that the knight can go in one step. But everybody, you see, the knight basically jumps from where it is to that square. So if a knight wants to capture a piece, that piece has to be in one of those green squares, at a square that the knight can jump to. So let me show you what I mean by this. All right, so everybody, let's look into this position. You see, the knight, everybody, is in the same square and the colors are the same. So if the knight wants, the knight is going to jump to go to those squares. Now, everybody, you see, the rook is in the way for the knight to go to c4. Right? If we want to move the knight to here, we can make an L shape like that. But you see, the knight jumps. So the knight cannot capture when it's mid-air. Therefore, the knight cannot capture the rook, but it can go right next to the rook. So for a knight to capture a piece, it has to be at the square it can go to. Just like the bishop, just like the queen, king, and the rook. And there is one black piece that the knight can capture right now, everybody. What can the white knight capture in this position? All right, let's go over the answer. Everybody, if you thought about the queen, you will be correct. Because let me erase the other L's right now. If we want to make an L, everybody, the knight could go here. And the knight is going to land on the queen, so the knight can capture the queen like that. And this is how the knight can capture this queen. All right, so everybody remember, the knight goes in an L shape. If a knight is at one end of the L, it jumps from this L all the way to the other end of that L. And you can rotate this L in different ways. So if a knight is at the top, it can go down to here. Or it could also, you can rotate this L to make it like this, and it could go from here to here. And everybody, we cannot capture our own pieces. So let me change the position a little bit. Let me put some white pieces into the board. Okay. Now everybody, as we can see, the knight can make some L's. The knight can make an L like this to the rook square. However, the knight cannot go to that rook's square because there is a white rook and we cannot capture our own pieces. This is very important, right? And there's also, everybody, a white pawn at f3 that the knight can try to make this L. The problem is this is a white pawn and we cannot capture our own pieces. That is against the chess rules. So the knight cannot go to that square right now because of the white pieces. All right. So everybody, we're going to look into the last piece the pawn, the piece that we have so much of. White and black, they both have 8 pawns. Now, everybody, pawn is the only piece that moves and captures in a different way. Pawn, everybody, is like a little soldier that we have. And even though pawn is a simple piece, the movement is actually one of the more complicated ones. Everybody, you see the pawn goes straight. It moves straight up. But a pawn is like marching, right? A pawn can only go one square. It goes up one square. Now you see, everybody, when a pawn first starts to move from its original position. So the original position for the pawn is the second rank, because this is where we originally place all of the pawns. For black, this is going to be the 7th line. When a pawn is first moving, it can also go 2 steps. But once that single pawn moves, everybody, it can only go 1 step at a time. Only 1 step at a time. Let's say black pushes this pawn down to here. Now, everybody, it appears that black is moving the pawn down, but if you flip the board, the black's up is this way right now, right? So white and black, since the chessboard isn't 2D, it's like this, right? If you are playing as white, you move this way. And if you're playing as black, you move this way. But if you see it on a 2D plane, it seems like the white pawn is going up and the black pawn is going down right now. No, they are both going up from their perspective. So a pawn only goes forward. It only goes forward in that direction. And when it first starts moving, everybody, it can go 1 square, but it could also go 2 steps. But once a pawn moves, so let's look into this f4 pawn from white's position. Once it moved, everybody, it can only go 1 square, like this. Okay, so a pawn always goes forward. And it can go 2 steps, so we didn't move these other white pawns yet. So if you want, you can move the d pawn 2 steps like this. Now, everybody, a pawn, as we said, goes forward, it moves forward, but it doesn't capture forward. This is very important. It captures diagonally like a bishop. But everybody, a pawn only goes 1 step when it is capturing. So remember, the bishop goes like an X, right? Everybody? Like an X. Now, the pawn cannot go backwards. A pawn can never go backwards. So a pawn cannot go back, and it cannot capture backwards. But a pawn goes up. So it captures forward. So everybody, you see, this white pawn can actually capture this black pawn, because if it's and it's diagonal like this. And if white captures this black pawn, it can go like that. Right now. Okay. Now everybody, let's look into, let's say white doesn't capture that pawn. And now we can look into these 2 pawns on the D file, on this D line. Now everybody, you see these 2 pawns are right in front of each other. But we said a pawn goes forward, and this is what these pawns are doing. They're trying to pass each other, but they can't. They're blocking each other's way. And as we mentioned, a pawn cannot go backwards. So this white pawn cannot move back. It cannot go forward because it's being blocked. So everybody, in this position, let me erase the other things. The white pawn that is sitting at this square, that's sitting at d4, cannot move at all right now. It is being blocked, so it cannot go forward. Now everybody, for this white pawn to be able to move, either this top black pawn, this black pawn is going to move away. For example, if white pushes his pawn to here, as we said, pawns, they capture diagonally forward, and for this black pawn, diagonally forward is going to be this square. So the black pawn, everybody, can actually capture this white pawn like this. And if the black pawn moves away, now we can actually move this white pawn forward. Another way for this white pawn to be able to move is if it captures a black piece. So let's say white moves the knight, everybody. Let's make an L shape for the knight. Let's make this L shape for the knight to here. So as we said, the knight jumps. So the knight is going to jump on top of those white pieces, and it's going to land at this square. It is black's turn. Let's say black moves this pawn to this square. Now everybody, it is in our pawn's diagonal, so our pawn can capture this black pawn like this. But in order to go diagonally, there has to be a piece to capture. Let me ask you all a question. Can this white pawn go to this square, to this e5 square right now in this turn? Everybody, the answer is no, because there is no piece there. There's no black piece there. And a pawn only goes diagonally when it is capturing a piece. If there is nothing to capture, a pawn can only go forward. So we cannot move the pawn to e5. That is against the chess rules. So we can actually capture the c5 pawn instead. Okay, so that is how the pawn goes, everybody. The pawn only moves forward, and it can go 2 steps when it's first started to move. You can also still move the pawn 1 square if you want, but once the pawn starts moving, it gets tired, so the pawn can only go 1 square at a time once it starts moving, only 1 square at a time. And everybody, a pawn cannot capture forward. It gets stuck. For a pawn to capture, it captures like a bishop diagonally. The bishop can go a long way. The pawn can only go 1 square. So the pawn captures in 1 square. Now, we said this is the original position, how we set up the game. Everybody, as we said, you cannot capture your own pieces. So when you first start to make some moves, you see, you can move a pawn up, right? Because a pawn is not blocked. So you can try to move the E pawn, F pawn, G pawn, all of the pawns that you want. But you cannot move the king, the bishop, the rook, the queen, because the pawns are blocking their way. But everybody, the knight can jump. So if you don't want to move a pawn, the knight can also jump right now. So let's see some L's. So this is an L shape that the knight can do. This is also an L shape that the knight can do. Now, this is, everybody, also an L shape that the knight can do, but the knight cannot go like in this green line, because in this position, that is a white pawn, and we cannot capture our own pieces. This is very important. You cannot have 2 pieces in 1 square, and you cannot capture your own pieces. Okay. So everybody, we finished all of the pieces. Please practice how the pieces move. And please also practice how the pieces capture other pieces. I'll see you all in our next class. Bye, everybody.